Nobody was supposed to see this. Not yet. Not like this. But once phone records enter a case, the story stops being about rumors and starts becoming about timelines, and that's exactly why this development around Lil Durk has the industry on edge right now. Because phone records don't argue. They don't care about narratives, loyalty, or public perception. They show who called who when, how long, and how often. And according to multiple reports, newly surfaced call data has forced investigators and fans to re-examine everything they thought they understood about this case. For months, the conversation around Lil Durk has lived in a fog of speculation. Online theories, selective leaks, carefully worded statements, but phone records cut through that noise in a way nothing else can. They don't tell a story emotionally, they tell it chronologically. And chronology is dangerous when it doesn't line up with public timelines. What's making this moment explode isn't just that the records exist. It's when certain calls allegedly happened, who they're linked to, and how often communication occurred during windows that were previously considered quiet. That's where everything starts shifting. Fans are already arguing. Some say this clears things up, others say it complicates them. Legal analysts are warning people not to jump to conclusions, but at the same time, they're admitting this kind of evidence is rarely meaningless. Especially when it surfaces this late. Social media is doing what it always does: screenshots, theories, thread breakdowns, TikTok timelines. But behind the scenes, this kind of evidence usually signals one thing: the story is entering a more serious phase. And here's the part nobody's comfortable admitting yet. Once phone records are part of the conversation, there's no going back to vibes and speculation. Everything gets slower, colder, more precise. So the real question isn't whether these records matter, it's what they're about to force everyone to confront next. The moment phone records enter a conversation, everything changes, not emotionally, structurally. Because speculation can survive vibes, but it cannot survive timestamps. And that's why this new development around Lil Durk has shifted the energy from internet noise to something colder, sharper, and a lot more serious. Up until now, the case existed in fragments. Headlines without context, leaks without confirmation, clips circulating faster than facts. Fans filled in the gaps the way fans always do, defending, accusing, theorizing depending on where their loyalty landed. The story moved fast because it had room to move. No fixed points, no anchors. Phone records remove that freedom. Because once you introduce call logs, the case stops being about what people say happened and starts being about when things actually occurred. And timing is where narratives usually collapse. What's important here isn't just that phone records surfaced. It's the timing of their appearance in the broader arc of the case. Evidence like this doesn't usually leak early. It surfaces when investigators are either tightening the net or forcing a response. Either way, it signals confidence. And confidence from that side usually means they believe the data speaks for itself. The records allegedly cover a stretch of time that was previously treated as a dead zone, hours and days where nothing significant was supposed to have happened. Public timelines framed that window as quiet, transitional, irrelevant. But the call logs suggest otherwise, and that's where the discomfort begins. Because phone records don't accuse anyone directly, they don't assign intent, they just present proximity, frequency, patterns. And patterns are what prosecutors and analysts obsess over. One call means nothing. Two calls mean curiosity. Repeated contact at specific moments, that's when eyebrows go up. What has people uneasy is the clustering. Calls grouped around moments that were publicly described as unrelated. Contacts that spike and then abruptly stop. Gaps that don't align with public statements. It's not one smoking gun, it's a constellation. And constellations are harder to explain away. Fans rush to defend immediately, which is expected. Loyalty moves faster than analysis, but even among defenders, the language shifted. Less certainty. We need more information. That change matters. It means the records introduced doubt where confidence used to live. Critics, on the other hand, went too far too fast. Jumping straight to conclusions, assigning meaning before understanding scope. That always backfires because phone records are precise but incomplete. They show that communication happened, not what was said. Anyone pretending otherwise is either uninformed or dishonest. Still, precision creates pressure, because once timestamps are public or even semi-public, every other piece of the story gets reevaluated against them. Statements. Movements, alibis, everything becomes a puzzle piece instead of a standalone claim. The industry felt this shift immediately. You could see it in how coverage changed. Articles became cautious. Language tightened. Phrases like allegedly and according to sources started doing heavy lifting. That's not coincidence. That's legal awareness creeping into editorial decisions. Artists close to the situation went quiet, not supportive posts. Not defensive posts. Quiet. Silence is often louder than statements, especially in moments like this. People speak when they feel safe. They go silent when they're waiting. Waiting for what? Usually for confirmation of scope. Because another uncomfortable truth about phone records is that they rarely exist alone. They're usually paired with other data, location pings, metadata, device histories. The phone is just the entry point. Once it's in play, the ecosystem opens. That's why some fans started asking the question nobody wanted to ask yet. Why now? Why did these records surface at this point in the process? Why not earlier? Why not later? Timing in legal cases is strategic. Evidence isn't revealed randomly. It's revealed when it applies maximum pressure or clarifies a next step, and that suggests the case is moving. Another layer that complicates everything is perception. Lil Durk isn't just an artist, he's a symbol to a lot of people. Of survival, of loyalty, of Chicago. That symbolism intensifies reactions on both sides. Supporters interpret developments as attacks. Critics interpret them as confirmations. Phone records don't care about symbolism. They don't adjust for legacy or influence. They flatten everything into data points. And that flattening is uncomfortable for a culture built on narrative control. Social media tried to reclaim that control immediately. Threads popped up explaining why call logs don't mean anything. Others popped up explaining why they mean everything. Neither extreme holds up, but the volume itself matters. It means the records disrupted equilibrium. Behind the scenes, legal analysts started circling the same detail. Context: phone records are only powerful when placed alongside other evidence. On their own, they're neutral. In combination, they can become devastating or exculpatory depending on alignment. That's the tension hanging over this moment. Because nobody knows yet which direction the alignment points, and that uncertainty is heavy. Industry insiders started whispering about strategy shifts, about whether silence was the right move, about whether clarification would help or hurt. Because once data enters the public conversation, the instinct to explain can be dangerous. Every explanation creates a new timeline. Every timeline can be checked. The smartest move in moments like this is often restraint. But restraint reads like guilt to people who don't understand process. That's why this phase is so volatile. Fans want reassurance. Critics want accountability. Media wants clarity. Legal systems want patience. Those desires don't align easily. What's undeniable is that the conversation has crossed a threshold. It's no longer about what people believe, it's about what can be mapped. And mapping takes time. The phone records didn't end the debate. They narrowed it. They forced everyone to look at the same clock. And when everyone starts checking the same timestamps, stories either lock in or fall apart. Right now, nobody knows which way this is going, but one thing is clear. The era of loose speculation is over. The case has entered its most dangerous phase, not because guilt has been proven, but because ambiguity has. And ambiguity with data attached doesn't stay ambiguous forever. The next piece isn't going to be louder, it's going to be clearer. And when clarity arrives, somebody's version of events isn't going to survive it. Once people calmed down from the initial shock, the conversation around the phone records shifted into something more dangerous. Pattern analysis, that's where cases stop being emotional and start becoming mathematical. Because you can debate intent all day, but frequency, timing, and repetition create their own language. And right now, that language is making a lot of people uncomfortable. What analysts started noticing wasn't one suspicious call. It was rhythm, calls that clustered around key moments. Bursts of communication that aligned too closely with events that were publicly framed as disconnected. Silence that arrived suddenly after periods of heavy contact. These aren't accusations, they're anomalies. And anomalies are what investigations lean into hardest. This is where the second layer of tension set in. Supporters tried to anchor the conversation in common sense. Everybody makes calls. Celebrities talk to a lot of people. You can't read intent from a log. All true. Completely true, but what those defenses avoid is the uncomfortable middle ground. Patterns don't have to prove guilt to raise questions. They just have to exist. critics went the opposite direction, declaring the records definitive proof of wrongdoing. That leap is just as reckless. Phone records don't show content, they don't show context, they don't show motive. Anyone pretending otherwise is either chasing clicks or misunderstanding how evidence actually works. But here's the problem: legal cases don't live at the extremes. They live in accumulation. And accumulation is exactly what this feels like. The more people looked at the data, the more it seemed like the records weren't introduced to prove a single claim. They were introduced to support something else. That's a crucial distinction. Phone logs are rarely the headline evidence. They're the connective tissue, the thing that links people, places, and moments into a coherent structure. That realization shifted the mood fast, because if the records are connective tissue, then something else is already on the table. Something that required reinforcement, something that needed temporal validation. And that's where speculation turned colder. Why release these now? Because timing in legal processes is never accidental. Evidence is revealed when it strengthens leverage, forces cooperation, or locks in a narrative before it can shift. The introduction of phone records suggests one of two things. Either investigators are closing gaps or they're applying pressure. Both scenarios carry weight. Another unsettling detail began circulating quietly among legal commentators. The possibility that the records weren't newly discovered. They may have existed for some time. If that's true, then their appearance now isn't about discovery, it's about deployment. That distinction matters. Deployment implies strategy. It implies sequencing. It implies that whoever released or confirmed their existence did so knowing how the public and media would react. Knowing that once timestamps are discussed openly, other parties are forced to align their stories carefully. And alignment is hard and coherence is being tested. One particularly troubling detail analysts keep circling is the abrupt change in communication patterns at a specific point, a noticeable drop-off, a sudden quiet. That kind of silence can mean many things: travel, device changes, legal advice, or something else entirely. The records don't explain it, they just show it. An unexplained silence is as loud as frequent contact. This is where things get psychologically heavy. Humans instinctively fill gaps. Silence invites projection. Everyone sees what they expect to see. That's why restraint is critical and rare. Media outlets struggled with this phase. Too little coverage feels like suppression. Too much feels irresponsible. So they hedge. They publish what we know so far, pieces that say very little while implying a lot. That ambiguity feeds anxiety. Meanwhile, legal experts keep repeating the same warning: phone records are rarely the end. They are the bridge. Bridges lead somewhere, and that somewhere is usually either corroboration or contradiction. The case is now in a phase where every existing claim is being silently checked against data. Statements made months ago, movements described in interviews, timelines offered casually, all of it is being reevaluated with precision. This is where cases often fracture, not because someone is caught lying outright, but because small inconsistencies pile up. 10 minutes here, an hour there, a call that shouldn't have happened if a story were true. It doesn't take much. And that's why this moment feels heavier than previous twists. There's no spectacle here, no dramatic reveal, just slow tightening. A sense that the margin for error has disappeared. Fans want resolution, critics want accountability. But the truth is, this phase is about preparation, about positioning, about deciding who speaks, who stays silent, and who waits. Nothing has been proven, but something has been activated. The phone records didn't answer questions. They changed the type of questions being asked, and once that shift happens, the story doesn't speed up, it deepens. The next development won't be explosive, it'll be precise. And precision is what finally forces narratives to choose whether they align with reality or collapse under it. At this stage, the loudest sound in the room isn't outrage, it's restraint. And restraint in cases like this is never accidental, it's strategic. Because when phone records enter the equation and patterns start forming, silence stops being avoidance and starts being positioning. That's exactly where the case sits now. The public conversation slowed, but behind the scenes, everything accelerated. Lawyers don't rush to cameras when data is being cross-checked. They pull inward, they review, they map, they anticipate. And the shift from public noise to private calculation is one of the clearest signs that a case has moved into a more serious phase. What makes this part especially tense is that nothing new has been officially released, yet the weight of what's already surfaced keeps growing. That's how accumulation works. Each piece of evidence becomes heavier once it's contextualized by the next. Phone records don't shout, they linger, and lingering evidence forces everyone involved to choose their next move carefully. Fans are starting to notice that the usual rhythms of denial and defense haven't returned. No aggressive rebuttals, no emotional statements, no attempts to redirect the narrative. That absence feels intentional. Because in legal terms, emotional responses often create liabilities. Calm creates flexibility. This is where perception and reality begin to diverge sharply. To the public, silence looks suspicious. In courtrooms, silence often looks disciplined. That tension is hard for audiences to sit with, especially in a culture that expects constant updates. But legal processes don't feed the algorithm, they starve it. What's happening now is alignment. Every previous statement, public or private, is being quietly weighed against the data. Timelines offered casually months ago are being re-examined. Associations that seemed distant are being remeasured by frequency and proximity. Even seemingly insignificant details gain relevance when layered over call logs. This is the phase where small contradictions matter more than big accusations. Because big accusations can be denied, small inconsistencies multiply. Another unsettling development during this phase is the tightening of language from people adjacent to the situation. Friends, associates, industry voices, everyone sounds more careful now. Words are chosen slowly, jokes disappear, casual references stop. That kind of collective restraint doesn't happen unless people feel exposure. And exposure doesn't require guilt, it only requires connection. Phone records introduce that risk. They show networks, not narratives. They don't accuse anyone of wrongdoing, but they reveal who exists within proximity. And proximity is enough to complicate lives. That's why this stage feels so heavy. It's not dramatic, it's procedural. And procedural moments are where cases are actually decided. Legal experts keep emphasizing that this is where leverage gets tested. Evidence like phone records often becomes useful not because of what it proves outright, but because of how it pressures cooperation. People reassess. Some choose to talk, others choose to negotiate. Silence at the top doesn't mean nothing is happening below, quite the opposite. The psychological toll of this phase is real. Waiting is harder than reacting. Uncertainty weighs heavier than accusation. Fans want answers, but the people involved want control. That imbalance creates frustration, speculation, and sometimes reckless commentary. And reckless commentary is exactly what legal teams warn against. Because every hot take becomes a potential exhibit. Every viral claim becomes something that needs to be countered or contextualized later. Silence avoids that trap. Another detail that's fueling tension is the growing belief that the phone records are only one layer of a broader evidentiary stack. Rarely do investigators surface call logs without corroboration. They are typically paired with other forms of data, location metadata, timestamps from unrelated sources, transactional records. The phone is the gateway, not the destination. That's why this phase feels like the calm before something heavier. Media outlets seem to understand this instinctively. Coverage has shifted from speculative headlines to cautious updates. Phrases like "according to sources familiar with the matter" dominate. Nobody wants to overstep. That collective caution is telling. At the center of all of this remains Lil Durk, whose public presence has narrowed significantly. That narrowing isn't retreat, it's insulation. Public figures often reduce visibility when legal exposure increases, not because they're guilty, but because visibility multiplies risk. Every appearance becomes a potential misinterpretation. Every lyric becomes scrutinized. Every post becomes dissected. Silence, in contrast, offers fewer angles of attack. This phase also reveals something uncomfortable about audience expectations. Many fans demand transparency without understanding that transparency in active legal matters can be self-destructive. The desire for reassurance conflicts directly with the need for caution. That conflict fuels resentment. Supporters feel abandoned. Critics feel validated. Everyone fills the silence with their own conclusions. But conclusions formed in the absence of information are rarely accurate, they're emotional. The legal process doesn't care about emotional conclusions. What it cares about now is consistency. Consistency across timelines. Consistency across statements. Consistency across data sources. And consistency is fragile. One misalignment can unravel months of narrative stability. That's why this stage feels like a tightening coil. Nothing has snapped yet, but the pressure is increasing steadily. Another factor amplifying the tension is the broader cultural context. High-profile cases. The tone shift is unmistakable. The story has moved out of the rumor economy and into the accountability economy. That's why leaks slow down. That's why language tightens. That's why sources suddenly can't comment. When stakes rise, access shrinks. What's happening now is consolidation. Investigators aren't gathering anymore, they're sorting. They're not asking broad questions, they're testing specific ones. They're not looking for new angles, they're stress testing existing narratives to see where they fracture. This is where phone records become more than data. They become filters. Every claim that's been floating for months now has to pass through a single question. Does the timing support it? If it does, it survives. If it doesn't, it gets flagged. And once something gets flagged internally, it rarely goes away quietly. That's why this part feels heavier than earlier twists. Earlier moments sparked arguments. This one is forcing recalculation. Behind the scenes, legal teams are doing something very specific right now: scenario mapping. They're not betting on one outcome, they're preparing for multiple. What happens if the records align cleanly? What happens if they partially conflict? What happens if they contradict something already on file? Each scenario requires a different response strategy. And response strategy is where careers get shaped. One thing that's become clear is that the phone records didn't surface to satisfy public curiosity. They surfaced to force decisions. Evidence like this changes leverage dynamics. It can prompt cooperation, it can prompt silence, it can prompt negotiation, but it almost always prompts movement. That movement just isn't visible yet. This is also the stage where third parties start feeling the heat. People who assumed they were peripheral begin realizing that proximity is enough to be pulled into clarification mode. Interviews get requested, statements get drafted and redrafted. Some people comply quickly. Others lawyer up immediately. That divergence matters, because cooperation timelines tell stories of their own. Another subtle but important shift during this phase is how media coverage has repositioned itself. Notice how fewer outlets are rushing to break anything. Instead, they're waiting to confirm. That patience isn't ethical awakening, it's legal caution. Nobody wants to be the outlet that publishes something incomplete when the stakes are this high. Silence isn't protection anymore, accuracy is. Fans are feeling that gap intensely. The absence of updates creates anxiety. Some fill it with confidence, others fill it with dread, most fill it with speculation. But speculation at this point doesn't move the story, it just amplifies emotion. Emotion, however, doesn't influence outcomes here. Structure does, and the structure is tightening. One underdiscussed aspect of this phase is the emotional toll on everyone involved, not just the headline figure. Families, teams, associates, entire circles feel the pressure when a case transitions from public chatter to procedural reality. Phones stop ringing the same way, meetings get postponed, futures feel less certain. That kind of stress reshapes behavior. People become cautious, calculated, measured. The vibes change. And when the vibes change at scale, it's because people sense that outcomes are approaching. Another reason this phase feels ominous is that it's when contradictions are most likely to surface, not because someone is lying intentionally, but because memory is flawed. People misremember timelines, they compress events, they fill gaps unconsciously. Data doesn't do that. Data remembers everything. That's why phone records are so unforgiving. They don't care how time felt, they only show how it passed. As analysts revisit older claims through this lens, some statements that once sounded reasonable now feel unstable. Not incriminating, unstable. And instability invites follow-up. Follow-up invites exposure. This is where cases often pivot unexpectedly, not with a dramatic reveal but with a quiet reclassification. A witness changes status. A timeline gets amended. A scope gets expanded or narrowed. Those shifts rarely make headlines immediately, but they shape everything that comes after. Another factor raising tension is the growing awareness that this case now intersects with systems much larger than music. Digital privacy, surveillance norms, data retention. The public may focus on one name, but institutions are thinking about precedent. Because once phone records enter public discourse, they normalize a level of scrutiny that doesn't roll back easily. That has implications beyond this case. It also changes how future stories are told. This awareness has led some voices to step back entirely, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The tone has shifted from commentary to observation. People are waiting to see which direction the structure settles before attaching meaning. Waiting is uncomfortable. It creates a vacuum, and vacuums invite noise. But noise doesn't penetrate legal processes at this stage, it just echoes around them. Right now, the most important conversations aren't happening online. They're happening in rooms without cameras, on phones that don't get leaked, in documents that aren't public yet. That's where the case is being shaped. The public is watching shadows on the wall while the structure is being built elsewhere. And that disconnect fuels frustration. Some fans are interpreting the quiet as a sign that nothing substantial will happen. Others see it as confirmation that something significant is being prepared. Both interpretations miss the point. This phase isn't about outcomes, it's about alignment. Everything that happens next depends on whether the data aligns cleanly or creates friction. Clean alignment leads to resolution. Friction leads to escalation. Neither happens quickly, but both are decisive. What makes this moment especially precarious is that once escalation begins, it's rarely reversible. Decisions get locked in, positions harden, narratives calcify. That's why everyone involved is moving slowly now. Slow isn't weak, slow is deliberate. And deliberate movement suggests that the margin for error is gone. This part of the story doesn't reward hot takes, it punishes them. It rewards patience, precision, and restraint. That's why the loudest voices have faded and the quietest ones are now the most relevant. The phone records didn't answer questions, they changed the rules of engagement. From here on out, every move will be interpreted through evidence, not emotion. Every silence will be strategic. Every statement will be scrutinized for alignment. The case has crossed into a phase where outcomes are shaped, not argued, and once shaping begins, the next development won't be ambiguous, it will be definitive. The only question left is whether that definition brings closure or opens a door no one is ready to walk through yet. If you've stayed with this story all the way to this point, understand something clearly. You're no longer watching entertainment unfold. You're watching a real-world process tighten in real time. This is the moment where narratives stop being flexible and start being tested. And once that happens, there's no rewinding the conversation back to speculation and vibes. So here's where you come in. Don't just skim this. Don't just react emotionally. Engage with what this phase actually represents. Ask yourself why phone records shift power so dramatically. Ask why silence suddenly feels heavier than statements. Ask why the loudest voices always disappear right before the most serious developments arrive. Drop your thoughts in the comments, but keep them sharp. Do these records clarify the story, or do they complicate it beyond repair? Is silence the smartest move right now, or does it create more suspicion than protection? And do you think this case is moving toward resolution, or toward something much bigger than anyone originally expected? If you want coverage that doesn't chase shock value but actually follows how cases evolve, make sure you subscribe. Turn notifications on, because the next update won't come with a warning. It never does. It'll surface quietly, and by the time it's public, the implications will already be locked in. Share this with someone who still thinks stories like this resolve overnight. With someone who believes no news means good news. With someone who doesn't understand how evidence reshapes everything long before outcomes are announced. Because this phase is where decisions get made, just not in public, and the next time this case moves, it won't be about interpretation, it'll be about consequence. Stay here, stay patient, stay critical. The story isn't ending. It's narrowing.